Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of the Borderstone. In the 177th year of the Common Reckoning, Balios, the ruler of the exiled Dogopolitans, led an army from Cadamos, leading it to war against the Orcs. He had sworn a solemn oath that he would either recapture Dogopolis for the Dogopolitans or die in the attempt. The army marched for many days, firstly to the east and then southwards, winding its way through the uninhabited woodland that covered the plains of southeast Halfland. Balios' plan was to approach Dogopolis from the north and appear unexpectedly from the virgin forest, taking the Orcs by surprise and marching into the city before any meaningful defence could be organised. His navigation was faultless. Balios and his troops emerged from the forest exactly where he had intended. Before them spread a fertile land of rich pastures, dotted with stands of trees. But other elements of the scene were not so idyllic. To their left, a grassy hill rose from the plain. Atop that hill, the Orcs had raised a huge black monolith, roughly squared, rearing to the sky, marking the boundary of the Orcan dominions. However, this menhir was not simply a boundary marker. It was dedicated to some foul Orcan god, a god of violence and death. At its foot, embedded in the verdant greensward, was an altar of black granite, stained with the blood of many sacrifices. But, disconcerting as it was to have this ominous Borderstone looming over him, Balios had more pressing problems. It was apparent that he had not gained the hoped-for element of surprise. Facing him was a line of 1,200 charging, armoured Orcan warriors. For although the forest was uninhabited, that did not mean it was unfrequented. Orcan hunters routinely chased their quarry through its tangled groves. Unbeknownst to Balios, his advancing army, which was hardly inconspicuous, had been observed by one such hunter, who had rushed back to Dogopolis to raise the alarm. There was no government in Dogopolis. The territory was divided between a number of Orcan warlords who were perpetually at war, each with the others. When Balios' grandfather, Aristos, had attacked Dogopolis some 40 years previously, the Orcs had united under a common leader. But by the time of Balios' attack, Orcan society in Dogopolis had further fragmented, and antagonisms had become entrenched. All of the warlords agreed that Balios' army must be utterly annihilated, but none of them was prepared to take a subordinate role in order to achieve that. The outcome was that each warlord marched his own host to the battle. Each was keen to kill and win glory on his own account, and there was nothing in the way of a higher command. Each warband simply lined up beside the next, and when Balios appeared from the trees, they all immediately charged at the Dogopolitans. Balios had arranged his column of march as follows. At the head were 150 armoured Dogopolitan cavalrymen. Behind them marched a cohort of 150 Dogopolitan heavy infantry, armoured, bearing shields, each with a heavy javelin and a sword. Next came Arnor, the dwarvish prince, and his force of 150 armoured, shield-bearing spear dwarves and 100 unarmoured crossbow dwarves. Behind Arnor's contingent marched 150 Cadamosians, split between 100 armoured hoplites and 50 unarmoured archers. Bringing up the rear was a second cohort of heavy Dogopolitan infantry. On the flanks were the Dogopolitan light infantry, to the right 150 Dogopolitan slingers, and to the left 150 Dogopolitan javelineers. Both the slingers and the javelineers carried a small shield and wore a short sword at their hip. Balios barked orders. The cavalry veered off to the left, intending to ride around the back of the Borderstone and take the orcs in the flank. The first cohort of Dogopolitan heavy infantry also moved to its left, adopting a defensive formation, bracing for the impact of the Orcan charge. The dwarves formed up to their right. Next in line should have been the Cadamossians, but it seems that the sight of the onrushing, snarling Orcan horde had somewhat disconcerted the Cadamossians, who remained stationary and did not advance into position. The second cohort of Dogopolitan heavy infantry was made of sterner stuff and pushed past the Cadamossians in order to take up a position to the right of the dwarves. The slingers on Balios' right moved further out to the flank, where they deployed into line and launched a volley of slingshot at the advancing orcs in the hope of disrupting or delaying the inevitable onslaught, but with minimal appreciable effect. The Dogopolitan defensive line continued to form. The javelineers took a position to the immediate left of Balios and the first cohort of his heavy infantry. The second cohort of heavy infantry had now formed up alongside the dwarves, but in the Dogopolitan rear the Cadamossians continued to quail, and still the orcs came on. Arnor had placed his crossbow dwarves in the front rank. From here they shot steadily and accurately at the mass of orcs bearing down on them. An Orcan warlord mounted atop a great wolf fell from the saddle, stretching his lifeless length upon the grassy ground, a crossbow quarrel embedded deep within his breast. But still the orcs came on. As the orcs came ever closer, the crossbow dwarves fell back through the spear dwarves behind them, and then the spear dwarves closed ranks, forming a shield wall, and lowered their spear points, bracing for the imminent Orcan impact. The Dogopolitan cavalry had ridden round the rear of the Borderstone and emerged from behind the hill, threatening the Orcan flank. But still the orcs came on. And now the orcs were within javelin cast of the Dogopolitan line. The Dogopolitan javelineers flung a first volley of javelins into the mob of orcs rushing toward them, and then another. The orcs wavered. The javelineers hurled their final javelins and then charged. Several orcs were cut down and the orcs around them fled. But along the rest of the line, still the orcs came on. On the Dogopolitan right, the slingers had continued their ineffectual attempts to break the Orcan advance with showers of slingshot. It availed them nothing. A group of orcs crashed into them, hacking and hewing. Orcan axes and bills did their deadly work. The surviving slingers fell back to a position alongside the second cohort of the Dogopolitan heavy infantry. And now, finally, the Cadamossians moved forward, shoring up the slingers' reformed line. On the opposite side of the battlefield, the Dogopolitan cavalry formed up, preparing to charge into the warband at the extremity of the Orcan line. The threatened orcs hastily closed ranks, presenting a daunting hedge of Orcan bills. The horsemen hesitated. Meanwhile, the exuberant javelineers had broken formation to chase the orcs fleeing before them. They rather regretted this when the curses and blows of the slave masters instilled fresh courage into the retreating orcs, who rallied and retaliated, inflicting heavy casualties on the disorganised javelineers, who were driven back. the orcs did not pursue the Javelineers, instead taking the opportunity to pause and reform their line. On the Dogopolitan right, the orcs continued to sweep forward. As the leading band of orcs bore down on them, the second cohort of Dogopolitan heavy infantry decided to take the initiative, and themselves charged headlong into the onrushing orcs, hurling their heavy javelins as they did so, and then following up with their sword points. For a moment it looked as though the orcs might break. But another band of orcs piled into the Dogopolitans' flank, which they had exposed by advancing out of the defensive line, and now it was the Dogopolitans who were under pressure. Arnor witnessed these events unfolding before him. The time had come. He ordered the dwarf beside him to sound his horn, and its clear tones echoed across the battlefield. To the Dogopolitans, those eerie notes spoke of remote mountain peaks, indomitable and eternal, and their hearts filled with hope. The orcs simply heard a challenge, to which they responded with jeers and the brazen blast of discordant trumpets. Arnor flourished his axe above his head and shouted an old battle cry, the battle cry of Orm, and the front rank of spear dwarves charged into the fray. In reply to the dwarvish horn, a Dogopolitan bugle rang out from the far side of the Borderstone as the Dogopolitan cavalry thundered forward, attempting to ride down the bill-wielding orcs before them, and Balios was swept up on a wave of enthusiasm and led the first cohort of Dogopolitan heavy infantry forward toward the line of orcs who had previously seen off his Javelineers. These various offensive actions by the Dogopolitans and their allies won varying amounts of success. Arnor's spear dwarves made short work of the orcs confronting them. The Dogopolitan cavalry found that their horses were most unwilling to impale themselves upon a hedge of orcan bills, and so their charge came to a sudden halt immediately in front of the orcan line. And Balios' advance stalled when the orcs facing him swarmed forward, hacking down his heavy infantry, cutting a path through the Dogopolitan formation. Suddenly, Balios had a snarling orc in his face, swinging a cleaver at his head. He sidestepped the first blow and parried the next, desperately defending himself, buying time for the remnants of his cohort of heavy infantry and the surviving Javelineers to come to his assistance. Even so, the fight was fierce, and Balios and his men were relieved to fight their way clear. They retreated to the relative safety of the Dogopolitan line, alongside the crossbow dwarves and a small group of spear dwarves surrounding Arnor, which he had held back from the fight. To Balios' right, the battle still raged. Having been driven back by the dwarves, the orcs now counterattacked. The dwarves stood firm, but the second Dogopolitan cohort took a mauling, and now the advancing orcs were among the surviving slingers and the Cadamossians. The Cadamossian archers were butchered, and the hoplites were hard pressed. Having failed to close with their orcan adversaries, the Dogopolitan cavalry fell back. The orcs continued to face the cavalry with a wall of bills, but began slowly edging to their left, intending to join forces with the orcs that were still menacing Balios. But the orcs facing Balios did not wait for these reinforcements to arrive. They scented victory and once more charged Balios and his men. That victory did not materialise. The Dogopolitans stood firm, as had the Cadamossian hoplites. Wave after wave of orcs had battered the Dogopolitan right, and time after time the orcs had been repulsed. Many Dogopolitans had perished, but so had many orcs. The blood-soaked ground in front of the Dogopolitan line was thickly strewn with Orcan corpses, but for the moment the Orcan tide was on the ebb. The orcs on the Dogopolitan right fell back and regathered, preparing themselves for one final push. The position on the Dogopolitan left, in front of Balios, was more confused. Here and there, small bands of orcs continued to attack the Dogopolitan line, but behind them, a large crowd of orcs was gathering, now reinforced by the orcs who had seen off the Dogopolitan cavalry, all steadying themselves for a final onslaught. The Dogopolitans waited, catching their breath, bracing for yet another assault. An unnatural silence descended over the battlefield, and then the harsh Orcan trumpets blared once more, and once again, all along the line, the orcs came on. On the Dogopolitan right, the spear dwarves bore the brunt of the attack, but dwarvish shields were stout, and dwarvish mail was well wrought. The dwarves stood their ground. To their right, a smaller band of orcs charged the Cadamossians and were swiftly repulsed, enabling the Cadamossian hoplites to come to the dwarves' assistance. And the intervention of the Cadamossians was decisive. The surviving orcs on the Dogopolitan right broke and ran. On the Dogopolitan left, a savage mass of soldiery surged forward, smashing into the survivors of Balios' heavy infantry. The Dogopolitans were outnumbered and almost overwhelmed as their formation fragmented, but still they fought on, and, standing at Balios' side, Arnor once more caused the dwarvish horn to be sounded. Enraged by this act of defiance, the horde of orcs swarmed forward once more. But now Arnor threw his last reserve, his personal bodyguard of spear dwarves, into the fray. The Orcan surge stalled, and the defenders slowly began to push the orcs back, inch by bloody inch. And then, all of a sudden, the orcs were in full flight, routing from the field, and the battle was won. Thus were the orcs defeated, and so ended the Battle of the Borderstone.